I'll never forget the exact time the phone rang. It was 2:17 in the afternoon, a Thursday like any other, until it wasn't. My Uncle Greg's voice cracked on the other end, and that was all it took for my chest to tighten. "Nathan, it's your mom. She's had a heart attack. It's bad. You need to come to the hospital now." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. I felt a wave of nausea rising, but I swallowed hard, trying to stay grounded. "Is she?" I couldn't even finish the sentence. "She's critical," Greg said, his voice trembling, "but she's asking for you." I stumbled into the living room, barely aware of the world around me. Lauren was there, sitting at the dining table, her laptop open and her phone pressed to her ear. Her posture screamed authority, back straight, head tilted slightly as she barked orders to someone on the other end. The image of her, so composed and detached, was jarring against the chaos erupting inside me. "Lauren," I called, my voice a mixture of urgency and desperation. She held up a finger without even glancing in my direction. I stood there, shifting my weight from one foot to the other, waiting for her to finish. When she finally ended the call, she sighed loudly, clearly annoyed. "What is it, Nathan? I'm about to jump on another meeting." "It's my mom," I said, my voice cracking. "She's had a heart attack. I need to get to the hospital." Her brows furrowed slightly, but instead of the concern I'd hoped for, there was only mild irritation. "Can't you take an Uber? I've got back-to-back calls all afternoon." An Uber? She wanted me to take an Uber while my mother lay in a hospital bed, possibly dying. I stared at her, waiting for her to realize how absurd her response was. But she simply opened her laptop and started typing, as if my crisis were nothing more than a minor inconvenience in her schedule. "Are you serious right now?" I said, my voice rising. She looked up, annoyed. "Nathan, what do you want me to do? Cancel my entire day? I have deadlines." Something snapped inside me. Maybe it had been building for years, the dismissiveness, the lack of empathy, the way she always seemed to put her career above everything else. But this moment, this was the breaking point. "I'll drive myself," I said, my voice cold. "Don't worry about me interrupting your day." I grabbed my keys and walked out the door, my mind racing with a cocktail of emotions: fear for my mom, anger at Lauren, and a growing sense of clarity. This wasn't just about today. This was about all the times I'd been made to feel small, unimportant. As I sped down the highway toward the hospital, I realized something. The woman I married no longer cared about me, if she ever truly had. This moment, the call, her response, was a wake-up call. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and something faintly metallic, like desperation. I arrived in a daze, my mind a whirlpool of worst-case scenarios. The nurse at the front desk directed me to my mom's room in the ICU. Each step down that sterile corridor felt heavier than the last. When I pushed open the door, there she was, my mom, Evelyn. The woman who raised me, taught me resilience, and always had a kind word, now looked fragile and diminished, surrounded by beeping monitors and 4 lines. Uncle Greg was sitting by her bedside, his hands clasped tightly. He gave me a sad nod as I approached. "Mom," I whispered, kneeling beside her. Her eyes fluttered open, and she gave me the faintest smile. "Nathan," she rasped. Even in her weakened state, her voice carried warmth. I took her hand, careful of the tubes. It felt so small in mine, like the years had stolen her strength. "I'm here, Mom. I'm right here." She studied my face with a clarity that startled me. "You've always been a good son," she said, her voice breaking. "But you're not happy, Nathan. I've seen it." Her words struck me like a hammer. "Mom, let's not talk about that now. You need to rest." She shook her head, as much as her frail body allowed. "Listen to me," she said, her tone insistent. "Life is too short to waste it on people who don't see your worth." I blinked back tears, unable to respond. She must have known. All those family gatherings where Lauren barely engaged, where I'd made excuses for her absence or indifference. Mom had seen through it all. "Promise me," she whispered, her grip tightening slightly. "Promise me you'll choose happiness, Nathan. You deserve it." "I promise," I choked out, though the words felt heavy in my throat. Her hand went limp a few moments later. The monitors let out a flat, unrelenting tone, and the nurse hurried in. Uncle Greg put his arm around me, but I barely noticed. My world had just shifted on its axis. I don't remember much of what happened next. Signing papers, talking to doctors, arranging for the funeral. I floated through it all, numb and detached. But one thing kept replaying in my mind. Her last words. That night, as I sat alone in my car in the hospital parking lot, I let the grief wash over me. But beneath the grief was something else. A spark of clarity. Lauren's face flashed in my mind. Not her smile or any tender moment, but the cold, indifferent look she'd given me earlier that day. It was a look I'd seen far too often, and I realized I couldn't keep living like this. By the time I pulled into our driveway, my decision was made. I would honor Mom's final wish. It was time to take control of my life. When I stepped into the house, it was eerily quiet, save for the faint clicking of Lauren's keyboard in her office. For a moment, I stood there, gripping the doorknob, trying to summon the energy to walk in and tell her what had happened. But the thought of facing her cold indifference made my chest tighten. Instead, I walked straight to the bedroom, shutting the door behind me. The bed was immaculate, as it always was. Lauren's insistence on perfection, even in the smallest things. I sat down on the edge and stared at the wall, the weight of the day pressing down on me. My mother's words echoed in my head, "Promise me you'll choose happiness." I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I stared at the ceiling, going over every moment of the past few years. The fights, the distance, the way Lauren always seemed to prioritize her career over us. She hadn't even checked on me after I left for the hospital. Not a single call, not even a text. Around 3 a.m., I got out of bed and sat at my desk. The glow of the laptop screen illuminated the darkroom as I typed a name into the search bar. Sophia Hart, attorney at law. Sophia had helped a coworker of mine through his divorce a couple of years back, and he couldn't stop singing her praises. I clicked on her website and sent a quick inquiry before shutting the laptop. The decision was made. The next morning, I sat across from Sophia in her downtown office. She was sharp, professional, and sympathetic without being overly emotional. "Nathan," she said after I explained everything, "it sounds like you've been carrying a lot of this on your own for a long time." I nodded, unsure how to respond. "Well," she continued, "the good news is, if Lauren has been as distant as you say, this could work in your favor. You've done most of the financial heavy lifting, correct?" "Correct," I said. Lauren's job paid well, but she had a knack for spending. Meanwhile, I'd been quietly saving, ensuring we had a financial cushion. "Then here's what we'll do," Sophia said, sliding a notepad toward me. "First, gather all your financial documents, bank statements, investment accounts, the works. Next, we'll draft the divorce papers, and I recommend you also take steps to secure your share of the assets before she can act." I hesitated. "You mean close the joint accounts?" Sophia nodded. "It's not about being cruel. It's about protecting yourself. Once she realizes what's happening, things could escalate." As I left her office, I felt a strange mix of emotions: guilt, anxiety, and, above all, relief. For the first time in years, I felt like I had a plan. That evening, I started going through our financial records. The more I dug, the more resentful I became. While I'd been meticulously budgeting and saving, Lauren had been treating our joint account like her personal piggy bank. Designer bags, luxury vacations, expensive dinners with clients. It was all there in black and white. By the end of the week, I had moved my share of the money into a separate account. I also gathered personal items that had sentimental value. My late father's watch, a few family photos, and some heirlooms my mom had passed down to me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was betraying her, even though I knew deep down that this was about survival. Lauren had always been the dominant one in our relationship, and for years, I'd let her control the narrative. But not anymore. When I met with Sophia again to review the divorce papers, she smiled approvingly. "You're doing the right thing, Nathan," she said. "This is the first step toward a new chapter." As I drove home, I rehearsed how I'd tell Lauren. But when I walked through the door, there she was, sitting at her desk, completely engrossed in her work. She didn't even notice me come in. I stood there for a moment, watching her. She looked the same as she always did, polished, composed, and utterly detached. The rift between us felt like a chasm now, impossible to bridge. I'll leave the papers on her desk, I decided, knowing that would be more fitting. She'd always been about efficiency and businesslike exchanges. Why should the end of our marriage be any different? I had spent the entire day pacing the house, going over my decision for what felt like the 100th time. The papers were neatly stacked in a folder on my desk, each page a symbol of everything that had gone wrong in our marriage. It was oddly poetic, in a way. Lauren loved structure, control, and things being presented in an orderly manner. These papers, with their clean, unflinching declarations of separation, were the epitome of that. Around midnight, I walked into her office. The room was immaculate, as always. Her desk was a reflection of her personality, everything aligned, not a pin out of place. I placed the divorce papers squarely in the center, ensuring they were impossible to miss. Beside them, I left a note, short, pointed, and honest. Lauren, I've taken my share of the savings, the heirlooms my mother left me, and the house. Don't worry, I've left everything well documented, because I know how much you value order. I can't live like this anymore, being a supporting character in your story. It's time I wrote my own. I stood there for a moment, taking in the life we had built, or rather, the life I had built and she had dominated. It was a hollow thing, built on convenience rather than love. With one last glance, I turned and left the room. Before heading out, I double-checked everything. The locks on the joint accounts had been set earlier that day. I'd already moved into my mother's house, and most of my personal belongings were there. All that was left now was to walk away. The drive to my mother's house was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels heavy and contemplative. As I pulled into the driveway, I couldn't help but think about the irony. This house, where I'd grown up, now felt more like home than the one I had shared with Lauren. By morning, Lauren would see the papers. I wondered how she would react. Would she be angry? Indifferent? Part of me hoped she would feel something, even if it was just the sting of loss. But the other part of me, the part that had spent years feeling invisible, knew better. The next morning, my phone buzzed incessantly. I ignored it, knowing exactly who it was. I had no interest in hearing her voice, no desire to listen to her inevitable tirade. Instead, I spent the day unpacking boxes at my mother's house, filling the empty space with memories of my own choosing. By midday, Lauren's messages shifted from anger to desperation. Nathan, I just saw the papers. Can we talk? Please. Another buzz. What do you mean you've taken the house? How could you do this to me? I sighed, putting the phone down. This was what Sophia had warned me about, Lauren trying to regain control. But I wasn't the same person anymore. I had drawn the line, and there was no going back. Later that evening, I received an email from her, a long-winded message filled with accusations, guilt-tripping, and a few thinly veiled threats about making me pay. I didn't respond. It wasn't worth the energy. Instead, I forwarded the email to Sophia. When I finally allowed myself to sit down and breathe, the enormity of what I'd done began to sink in. I had walked away from a life I had spent years building, but it wasn't my life. It was hers. For the first time in years, I felt free. As I sat there in the quiet of my mother's living room, surrounded by familiar things, I realized something profound. This wasn't just about leaving Lauren. It was about reclaiming myself. When I woke the next morning, there was an eerie calm. The sun filtered through the curtains of my childhood bedroom, and for the first time in years, I felt no urgency, no pressure to perform or cater to someone else's needs. It was just quiet, peaceful. That peace was short-lived. By mid-morning, my phone was buzzing nonstop. Missed calls, voicemails, and texts from Lauren filled my notifications. I didn't need to read them to know what they said. Still, curiosity got the better of me, and I scrolled through a few. Nathan, you can't be serious. Come home so we can talk about this. What do you mean you've taken the house? Do you even realize how unfair this is? You're being childish. Let's handle this like adults. The messages alternated between anger, condescension, and desperation. The pattern was so familiar it was almost laughable. For years, Lauren had used this same tactic to control me, berate, belittle, and then guilt trip. But this time, it wouldn't work. By early afternoon, the tone shifted. The messages became less about reconciliation and more about panic. She must have finally checked the joint accounts. Nathan, how dare you lock me out of our money? I worked just as hard for that as you did. I don't know who you think you are, but this isn't over. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But then I remembered standing in front of her the day before, desperate for her support while my mom lay dying, and being dismissed as an afterthought. That memory hardened my resolve. Back in the house we once shared, Lauren's carefully constructed world was unraveling. She had always prided herself on control over her career, her image, and, to some extent, me. Losing access to the accounts wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a crack in the foundation of her life. I imagined her pacing her pristine office, her perfectly styled hair slightly out of place for the first time in years. She'd probably called her assistant, barked orders to cancel meetings, and poured herself into damage control. But this was one situation she couldn't fix with a phone call or a power move. By evening, the messages stopped. I could picture her sitting in my house, staring at the divorce papers I'd left on her desk. I wondered how long it would take her to realize the truth. This wasn't just a temporary rebellion. This was final. The next day, I received an email from Sophia. Lauren had contacted her directly, demanding explanations and threatening to fight the terms of the divorce. Sophia, calm and composed as ever, assured me that everything was airtight. She's grasping at straws, Sophia told me over the phone. She knows she doesn't have much leverage, but that doesn't mean she won't try to make things difficult. I thanked her and hung up, feeling a strange mix of satisfaction and sadness. This was the woman I had once loved, the woman I had vowed to spend my life with. But now, all I felt was relief. By the end of the week, rumors of the divorce had started spreading at Lauren's workplace. A mutual friend called me to say she had overheard colleagues whispering about it during lunch. Lauren's image had always been impeccable, ruthlessly efficient, endlessly composed. Now, cracks were beginning to show. I heard she was struggling to juggle her responsibilities, that she was snapping at subordinates and missing deadlines. It wasn't surprising. For years, I had been the one silently supporting her, filling in the gaps she didn't even realize existed. Without me, her perfectly balanced life was starting to tilt. Part of me wanted to feel vindicated, to revel in her downfall. But instead, I felt a strange sense of detachment. This wasn't about her anymore. It was about me. That evening, as I sat on the porch of my mother's house, I looked out at the fading sunlight and realized I was starting to feel something I hadn't felt in years: hope. The first few days at my mother's house felt strange, like stepping into a memory. Everything was so familiar. The creak of the stairs, the faint smell of lavender from the old curtains, the way the sunlight streamed into the living room just as it had when I was a kid. It was comforting and bittersweet all at once. I spent my mornings cleaning, unpacking, and organizing the space. The house had been empty for a while, and dust had settled into every corner. But as I worked, I felt a sense of purpose, however small. It was grounding, giving me something to focus on besides the chaos I had left behind. Uncle Greg stopped by on the third day. He brought over a casserole and a bottle of whiskey, his version of condolences. "Figured you could use some company," he said, setting the food down on the kitchen counter. "Thanks, Greg. I appreciate it." He leaned against the counter, studying me for a moment. "You holding up okay?" I nodded, though the answer wasn't as simple as that. "It's a lot, but I think I'm finally starting to figure things out." Greg gave me a knowing look. "About time, kid. Your mom worried about you, you know? She saw more than she let on." I swallowed hard, the mention of my mom hitting me like a punch to the gut. Yeah, she made that pretty clear. We sat in the living room, sipping whiskey and reminiscing about Mom. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe. Over the next few weeks, I started to rebuild my life in small but significant ways. I reconnected with Julie, an old friend from high school who now ran a small art studio in town. We met for coffee one afternoon, and it was like no time had passed. "You look lighter," she said, studying me over the rim of her cup. I raised an eyebrow. Lighter? Yeah, like you've let go of something heavy. I can't explain it, but it's a good look on you. Her words stayed with me. Maybe she was right. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was walking on eggshells, constantly trying to meet someone else's expectations. Julie invited me to one of her workshops, and before I knew it, I found myself spending hours in her studio, working with my hands again. I had always loved woodworking, a hobby I'd all but abandoned during my marriage. Lauren had dismissed it as a waste of time, and I had let her. But now, as I sanded a piece of cedar or measured the perfect angle for a joint, I felt something awaken in me. One evening, after finishing a small table I'd been working on, Julie walked over and inspected it. "This is amazing, Nathan. You've got a real talent." I shrugged, feeling a little embarrassed. "It's just a hobby." "No," she said firmly. "This is more than that. You could do something with this." Her words planted a seed. Back at my mother's house, I found myself going through her things one evening, sorting through old boxes in the attic. Among the photo albums and keepsakes, I found a stack of letters, correspondence between my parents from when they were dating. The love and respect they had for each other practically leaped off the pages. I couldn't help but compare their relationship to what I'd had with Lauren. Where my parents had been partners, Lauren and I had been something else entirely. The letters were a reminder of what love could be and what it should be. That night, I sat at the dining room table, sketching out plans for a small woodworking business. It felt audacious, almost reckless, but also thrilling. For the first time in years, I was doing something for me. By the time the divorce was finalized, I barely recognized the person I had been just a few months earlier. Lauren had tried to contest the settlement, but Sophia had been right. She had no leverage. Her demands for alimony were denied, and I was granted sole ownership of the house. When I signed the final papers, I felt an overwhelming sense of closure. The chapter was officially over. As I packed the last of my mother's belongings into boxes and prepared to sell the house, I felt a pang of sadness. But it wasn't the kind of sadness that weighed you down. It was the kind that reminded you of what you'd lost and how far you'd come. I loaded the boxes into my car and took one last look at the house before driving away. The memories would always be there, but I was ready to move forward. It started with a call. "Nathan, please. Can we talk?" I stared at my phone, her name flashing on the screen. It had been weeks since I left the papers on her desk and walked out of her life. Weeks since I'd heard her voice. Part of me wanted to answer, to hear what she had to say. The other part, the smarter part, knew better. I silenced the call and slid my phone into my pocket, returning to the woodworking project in front of me. I had started crafting a set of shelves for Julie's studio, and the focus it required had become my therapy. With every cut, sand, and polish, I felt myself letting go of the anger, the hurt, and the memories of a life that no longer fit me. The calls didn't stop. When I didn't answer, they turned into texts, long, rambling messages alternating between apology and indignation. "Nathan, I'm sorry for everything. I know I've made mistakes, but we can fix this. We can rebuild. I can't believe you just left like that. After everything we've been through, you owe me a conversation." "Owe you?" I thought bitterly. I had spent years bending over backward to meet her expectations, sacrificing my own happiness for hers. I didn't owe her anything. One day, she sent a voice message. Her tone was softer, almost pleading. "Nathan, I know I haven't been the easiest person to live with, but I didn't realize how unhappy you were. I miss you. I miss us. Please, just call me back." I sat in my workshop, staring at the phone on the table. For a moment, I considered it. But then I remembered standing in that hospital room, holding my mother's hand as she told me to choose happiness. Lauren had shown me time and time again who she was. Calling her back wouldn't change that. A week later, she showed up at my mother's house unannounced. I was in the middle of sanding a table when I heard the knock at the door. Opening it, I found Lauren standing on the porch, dressed impeccably as always, but there was something different about her. Her usual air of confidence was replaced by an almost timid expression. "Nathan," she said softly, "can I come in?" I hesitated, but eventually stepped aside. She walked into the living room, her eyes scanning the space. "This is different," she said, gesturing to the modest furnishings. "It's not what I expected." I crossed my arms. "What do you want, Lauren?" She sighed, sitting down on the edge of the couch. "I want to talk. To explain." I stayed standing, watching her carefully. "I've been thinking a lot about us," she began. "About the things I did wrong. I know I was selfish, and I know I didn't prioritize you the way I should have. But I want to make it right. I still love you, Nathan." Her words hung in the air, but they didn't have the impact she'd hoped for. I felt nothing. "You still love me?" I said, my voice calm. "Lauren, when I came to you that day, when my mom was dying, you couldn't even take 5 minutes to care. That wasn't an isolated moment. That was us. That was our life." She flinched but didn't argue. "I don't doubt that you're sorry," I continued. "But this isn't about regret or apologies. It's about who we are. And who we are together isn't good for me anymore." Tears welled up in her eyes. "Nathan, please. I can change. I've already started changing." I shook my head. "I'm glad, Lauren. Truly. But this isn't about you changing. It's about me choosing myself for once." She sat there, silent, as the weight of my words sank in. After a few moments, she stood and smoothed her skirt. I guess there's nothing left to say." I nodded. "I hope you find happiness, Lauren, but it won't be with me." She walked out of the house, her heels clicking against the wooden porch. I watched her leave, a strange mixture of relief and finality settling over me. That night, as I sat in my workshop, I realized something profound. I wasn't angry anymore. For years, I had carried the weight of resentment and disappointment. But now, that weight was gone. This was freedom, not just from Lauren, but from the version of myself that had allowed her to take over my life. For the first time, I felt truly at peace. The attic was stuffy and dim, filled with the scent of dust and time. I hadn't been up there in years, but something about that day, maybe the closure I felt after Lauren's visit, drew me to it. My mother had always been a sentimental person, keeping mementos from every phase of her life. As I dug through the neatly labeled boxes, I came across photo albums, birthday cards, and little trinkets that I vaguely remembered from my childhood. Each one felt like a small connection to her, a piece of the person I was still grieving. Then I found it, a box with my name written on the lid in her careful handwriting. Inside were items she had saved just for me. My baby shoes, some of my old report cards, and a stack of journals. The journals caught my attention immediately. They weren't mine, but hers, filled with her looping script and little doodles in the margins. I flipped through the first few pages, drawn in by her words. She had started writing them when I was a teenager, and they chronicled everything. Her thoughts about me, her worries, and even her observations about Lauren. It was the entries about Lauren that stopped me cold. "Nathan seems happy with her, but I worry she doesn't see him for who he truly is. He's so kind, so giving, and I fear she takes more than she gives. They've been married 2 years now, and I don't want to interfere, but I can't help noticing how tired he looks. He never complains, but I see it in his eyes. I hope he knows he doesn't have to sacrifice himself to make someone else happy." I don't think I've ever seen Lauren ask Nathan how he's doing. Not really. It's always about her. He deserves someone who looks at him the way he looks at her. Tears blurred my vision as I read her words. She had seen it all, the imbalance, the way I'd lost myself in the relationship. And yet, she had never pushed me to leave. She had always supported me, even when she didn't agree with my choices. The last entry was dated just a few weeks before her heart attack. "I hope Nathan finds happiness, truly. I hope he sees his worth and realizes he doesn't have to settle for less than he deserves. If I could tell him one thing, it would be this: you're enough, Nathan, just as you are." Her words hit me like a freight train. I sat there in the attic, clutching the journal to my chest, and let the tears come. That evening, I sat on the porch with Uncle Greg, watching the sun dip below the horizon. I told him about the journals, about the things Mom had written. "She was always wise, your mom," he said, sipping his whiskey. "She saw people for who they really were. And she loved you, Nathan, more than anything." "I just wish I'd listened sooner," I admitted. maybe things would have been different. Greg shook his head. Don't do that to yourself. You made the choices you made because you weren't ready to see the truth. But you see it now, and that's what matters. I nodded, taking in his words. He was right. Mom's journals weren't just a reminder of what I had lost. They were a validation of the path I was now on. The next day, I called Sophia. Let's move forward with finalizing everything, I said. You've already won most of the battles, she replied. This is just the finishing touch. As I hung up the phone, I felt a sense of finality. Lauren's attempts to reconcile, the bitterness and regret. It was all behind me now. What lay ahead was mine to define. That night, I opened my sketchbook and started designing a new project. It wasn't just a table or a shelf. It was a plan for a life I was finally building on my terms. The fallout from the divorce was inevitable, but I never anticipated how quickly Lauren's life would start to crumble. She had spent years crafting an image of perfection, flawless in her career, impeccably put together in social settings, always in control. But that image was starting to crack, and the cracks were spreading fast. I heard about it first through mutual acquaintances. Rumors were flying around Lauren's workplace, where the news of our divorce had become a hot topic. The whispers weren't kind. She's not handling it well, one former colleague of mine told me over coffee. She snapped at her assistant last week over something minor, and she's been missing deadlines left and right. I wasn't surprised. For years, I had been the silent force behind her carefully balanced life. I took care of the house, the finances, the mundane details she didn't want to bother with. Without me, it was no wonder she was struggling. Lauren's desperation to regain control manifested in one last-ditch effort to salvage what she could from the divorce. She contacted Sophia again, this time demanding alimony. She argued that I had benefited from her career, that I owed her compensation for supporting her ambitions. Sophia called me immediately. She's grasping at straws, Nathan, she said. With her income and the evidence we've gathered about her financial independence, she doesn't have a leg to stand on. She was right. Lauren's request was denied, and the divorce settlement remained as it was, fair and final. I imagined her reaction when she got the news. She wasn't used to losing, and she certainly wasn't used to being told no. For someone who had built her life around control, this must have felt like the ground falling out from beneath her. The turning point came when Lauren showed up at my mother's house again. It was late in the evening, and I had just finished cleaning up my workshop when I heard the knock. I opened the door to find her standing there, her hair slightly disheveled, a rare sight. Her makeup was smudged, and she looked tired, not just physically, but emotionally. Nathan, she said softly, please, can we talk? I didn't want to let her in, but something about the way she looked, defeated, almost broken, made me step aside. She sat on the couch, staring at her hands as if searching for the right words. I don't know how to do this, she admitted after a long pause. I don't know how to be alone. Her confession surprised me. For years, Lauren had projected an image of independence and self-sufficiency. To hear her admit vulnerability was almost jarring. I'm not trying to hurt you, Lauren, I said, sitting across from her. But this isn't something I can fix for you. You need to figure this out on your own. Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't argue. She just nodded, wiping at her face with the sleeve of her blouse. I never thought I'd lose you, she said quietly. I thought you'd always be there. That's the problem, I replied. You never thought about what it cost me to stay. She looked up at me, and for the first time, I saw true regret in her eyes. But it wasn't enough. Not to undo the years of neglect, the countless moments where she made me feel like I was invisible. I hope you figure things out, Lauren, I said as I stood. But I can't be part of that anymore. She left without another word, and as I watched her car disappear down the street, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Sadness for what we had lost, relief for what I had gained, and a deep sense of finality. Over the next few weeks, the rumors about Lauren grew louder. Her work suffered, and her reputation as a powerhouse executive began to fade. Clients started pulling out of contracts, and her colleagues whispered about her behind closed doors. Without me to quietly stabilize the chaos in her personal life, she struggled to maintain the image she had built so carefully. One day, I got a message from a mutual friend. Did you hear? Lauren's company is considering letting her go. They're saying she's too volatile. It didn't bring me joy to hear it. If anything, it felt sad. Lauren had built her life around ambition and success, but in the end, it had left her hollow and alone. Meanwhile, my own life was beginning to flourish. The woodworking business I had started was gaining traction, thanks to word-of-mouth recommendations and a little help from Julie. Each project felt like a step towards something meaningful, something I had created with my own two hands. As I stood in my workshop one evening, sanding the surface of a new table, I realized something profound. I didn't feel anger toward Lauren anymore. She had made her choices, and I had made mine. The difference was, I had finally chosen myself. The day the divorce was finalized felt like the closing of a heavy door, a soundless, profound end to a chapter of my life that had been weighed down by compromise and quiet despair. I didn't throw a party or mark the occasion with fanfare. Instead, I spent the evening in my workshop, the rhythmic sanding of wood grounding me in the reality of my new beginning. The house I'd grown up in was sold within weeks. The decision wasn't easy, but I knew it was necessary. Holding onto the house felt like holding onto the past, and I was ready to move forward. The proceeds gave me the financial freedom to do something I hadn't dared to dream of before. I invested in a space for my woodworking business. The first time I walked into the small, sunlit workshop I'd leased on the edge of town, I felt an overwhelming sense of purpose. The wide open space, the scent of fresh lumber, the hum of possibility. It was mine, all mine. I spent days setting it up, organizing tools, and sketching designs for the projects I wanted to create. Julie stopped by one afternoon, bringing coffee and her ever-encouraging presence. "This is incredible, Nathan," she said, running her hand over the surface of a table I just finished. "You've got something really special here." I smiled, feeling a warmth I hadn't felt in years. "Thanks, Julie. It feels good to finally be doing something that's mine." She nodded, her eyes meeting mine. "It suits you." Her words lingered long after she left, and for the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to wonder about the possibility of love. Real, mutual, supportive love. But I wasn't in a rush. For now, I was content with the life I was building on my own. Lauren, on the other hand, wasn't faring as well. The last I'd heard, she had lost her job. The whispers about her erratic behavior and missed deadlines had finally caught up with her. It was strange to think of her struggling after years of watching her thrive, or at least pretending to. I occasionally wondered if she had learned anything from the experience. Had she reflected on the choices that had led her here? Or was she still clinging to the belief that she'd been wronged? I didn't know, and I didn't need to. Lauren's life was no longer my concern. One afternoon, while organizing some old sketches, I came across my mother's journals again. Her words, so full of wisdom and love, were like a guiding hand. "You're enough, Nathan, just as you are." I read those words over and over, letting them sink in. For years, I had defined myself by my role in someone else's life, first as Lauren's husband, then as the dutiful son. But now, I was discovering who I was outside of those roles. The woodworking business flourished in ways I hadn't expected. What started as a small side project grew into a full-time venture, with clients seeking me out for custom furniture and unique designs. I even started teaching workshops at Julie's studio, sharing my skills with others, and building a community that felt genuine and supportive. One evening, as I locked up the workshop, I stood outside and looked at the sign hanging above the door, Nathan's Craftworks. It wasn't flashy or elaborate, but it represented everything I had worked for, a life built on authenticity and self-worth. For the first time in years, I felt whole. The last time I thought of Lauren, it was in passing. I was walking through the town square, carrying a box of supplies, when I spotted her across the street. She was sitting on a bench, staring at her phone, looking as polished as ever but somehow smaller. She didn't see me, and I didn't approach her. There was no bitterness, no anger, no longing, just a quiet acknowledgement of the life we'd shared and the life we now lived apart. That night, I sat in my workshop, sketching a design for a rocking chair I'd promised to make for Julie's studio. The radio played softly in the background, and the smell of freshly cut wood filled the air. As I worked, I realized something profound. I was happy. Not in the fleeting, surface-level way I'd once tried to convince myself I was, but deeply, truly happy. For the first time, I wasn't living for someone else. I wasn't compromising or shrinking myself to fit into someone else's vision. I was living for me, and it was enough.